No one expected that what should have been a calming moment would turn into the beginning of a major upheaval. When Taehyung and Jungkook finally appeared, their faces full of sincerity, many expected ARMY to immediately accept them and calm the situation. In low voices and with their faces lowered, they both apologized. Not a defense. Not an excuse. Just honesty and a sense of responsibility. However, instead of sympathy, one surprising word resonated among ARMY, "No." Social media immediately erupted. Timelines filled with tears and disappointment. Some ARMY felt the wounds left behind couldn't be healed with just an apology. Others remembered, not expecting such a strong reaction. Taehyung looked even more downcast. Jungkook tried to control his emotions, but the look in his eyes couldn't hide the shock. The apology they had expected to be a bridge had instead become a deeper chasm. That's when the chaos truly began. The fanbase was divided. Support and opposition clashed. A simple moment turned into a massive, uncontrollable storm. A few hours after the resounding "No," the old post was resurfaced. Video clips, screenshots, and theories emerged non-stop. What had initially been a simple apology had now turned into a wild wave of speculation. Taehyung and Jungkook's every move was scrutinized, every expression interpreted with varying emotions. Some ARMY began to ask themselves, were they being too loud? But others remained steadfast, feeling their voices were finally being heard. Not out of hatred, but out of a deep sense of concern that had turned into hurt. Behind it all, Taehyung and Jungkook chose silence. There was no further clarification. No further defense. Just a silence that felt far heavier than 1,000 words. A silence that only made the chaos even greater. That night, many ARMY couldn't sleep. Some were angry, some were crying, and still others just stared blankly at the screen. The relationship that had felt so close suddenly felt fragile. Just an hour ago, the atmosphere had changed drastically. Jungkook, who usually kept everything to himself, finally opened up. With a slightly trembling voice and a meaningful gaze, he expressed the feelings he had kept to himself. There was no music. There was no laughter. Just a heavy silence. All eyes were on Taehyung. The few seconds that passed felt like an eternity. Taehyung didn't speak immediately. He simply stared at Jungkook. A gaze that was hard to describe, as if containing 1,000 emotions. Then, the reaction came. It wasn't long words. It wasn't an exaggerated expression. It was Taehyung's calm demeanor that silenced everyone. His small smile, his slow breath, and the way he kept his gaze on Jungkook without looking away, were enough to make anyone who saw him feel something different. That brief moment was now the talk of the town. Because sometimes, the deepest feelings don't need to be said out loud. There was no official statement. No lengthy clarification. But that's precisely where things felt even heavier. ARMY began to realize that this wasn't a momentary drama, it was a painful process for all parties. The love that had been so loud was now being tested in a long silence. Some fans began writing open letters. Not to demand, but to tell stories. About how Taehyung and Jungkook had been a place to come home to when life felt hard. About how the single word "No" was born not from hatred, but from a feeling so deep it didn't know how else to express it. And maybe, the messages got through. Because one night, without warning, another post appeared. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't long-winded. Just a short sentence that felt like a deep breath after a long period of holding back. A sentence that didn't apologize anymore, but acknowledged the hurt on both sides. ARMY fell silent. Many finally realized that not everything can be fixed quickly. Not every wound needs to be closed immediately. Sometimes, understanding takes longer than forgiveness. From that moment on, the chaos slowly took a turn. Not completely at peace, but more mature. The arguments subsided. Voices softened. The shattered hope began to be rebuilt, slowly. Taehyung and Jungkook still walked cautiously. Their every small step was now watched, not with anger, but with worry and prayer. Because Army finally understood, they were human too. They made mistakes. They got tired. They got hurt. It's about a relationship that's been tested, nearly destroyed, yet given the chance to grow, in a way that's more honest, more vulnerable, and more real than ever before. This story isn't over yet. But one thing's for sure, after everything that's happened, no one will ever love the same way again. Because this love has learned the meaning of endurance. There were no more sweet words spoken to soothe egos. No big promises made without being ready to keep them. All that remained was honesty, painful, shaky, but ultimately acknowledged. They learned that love isn't about who can endure the pain the most, but who dares to open up when afraid of loss. That holding on doesn't always mean holding on tight. Sometimes it means giving space so you can still breathe. There were still days of silence. Nights when doubt came without permission. But now, they chose to sit with that anxiety, rather than turning their backs on each other. This love wasn't going back to how it was before. It was changing. Slower, more conscious, and no longer blind. And perhaps, for the first time, they weren't holding on because they were afraid of losing each other, but because they finally understood why it was worth staying. Time passed, leaving scars that hadn't fully healed, but no longer bled as before. Each step felt hesitant, but now they walked side by side. Not dragging each other, nor overtaking each other. There was laughter again, though not as loud as before. There were smiles, not because everything was fine, but because they were learning to accept that not everything had to be perfect. They began to understand. Mature love isn't about always being happy, but about continuing to choose each other, even when happiness seems far away. Between silence and honest conversation, they rebuilt, slowly, fragile, but real. No longer promising it would always be easy. Only promising never to leave each other without explanation. And if one day the storm came again, they knew. This time, they wouldn't stand alone. Because love that had once nearly collapsed was no longer naive. It knew what it felt like to be broken. And that's precisely where they learned how to survive, together. Day after day passed without any definite marker. There was no major moment that changed everything. Just small habits that slowly stitched back together what had fallen apart. They learned to listen without interrupting. To understand without always agreeing. There were times when egos wanted to win again. But now they knew. Winning alone wasn't victory. Sometimes, old memories came like shadows, reminding them of words that had hurt them. But instead of denying them, they faced them together. Allowing the past to be a lesson, not a punishment to be repeated. This love no longer cried out for reassurance. It was present in simple things. A cup of coffee made without being asked. A text message saying, "Get home safely." And silence that felt enough because of their company. Perhaps one day they would change again. More tired, more mature, or even more silent. But as long as they had the courage to be honest, and the willingness to choose each other every day, this story would continue. Not as a perfect story, but as a tale of two hearts that were once broken and chose to stay, even though they knew how easy it would be to leave. And amidst it all, they finally understood one thing they had previously missed. Love isn't always there to save them. Sometimes it simply comes to teach them how to survive without losing themselves. There were times when silence felt terrifying. But now it was no longer empty. It was filled with presence. With the security that, even though they didn't always speak, they were there for each other. They no longer demanded to be fully understood. Because they understood that not all feelings could be translated. The important thing was the effort to stay. Despite fatigue, despite doubt, despite fear of repeating the same wounds. This love grew differently.